Thought I'd throw up a little tribute to Van Dog. These were some of my darkest times. Check the beard. Um, Today I was thinking a lot about. I was talking today to you about how I've been struggling with like the process of the futility of staying motivated while at the same time trying not to emphasize separateness and subjectivity. So I pretty much came to the conclusion that you have two options. You can drop everything in life that gives you a stimulus response and go meditate as a monk, or you can try to. Actually, you've got three options. You can do that. That'd be number one. You can continue to engage in a subjectively identified manner um, while still practicing focused spatial awareness in parts of your life that have much less stimulus. So that looks something like go to work, get thrown back into all of the suffering that your life hands you on account of you not being present enough to get through the day in a way that doesn't identify with all of it. And then at the end of the day, you go for a walk in the park and you experience presence, and then you rinse and repeat. And hopefully, presence grows at a rate where it eventually stabilizes in you and you don't suffer anymore. Third way would be, and I think I've talked about this before, but I'm starting to find more ways to apply it. The third way is to actively recondition the mind toward the type of function that it would seem to have if we were stabilized in a non-dual awareness. So pretty much, this does take my my natural compulsion to default toward a victim identity during playing poker. I'm pretty sure that like most poker players have this because anytime you're experiencing contrast, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a winning player even, the mind will experience a loss in a way that's subjective in the moment and throw you into whatever sort of belief systems you have, victim identities you have um, about the game and about how you're being hard done by. So there has to be some sort of routine or practice that you can implement to de-emphasize the mind's compulsion to go toward emphasis on separation. So notice that I'm not saying rewire the polarity of that mechanism. I'm not saying to go in and convince yourself that you're a fucking boss and that everything that you do is right and that you're better than everybody else. That's not solving the problem. That's going to plant you in a trap where you're probably going to feel better, but as far as it being related or helping your overall goal, which is to deepen into your truth. Like for me, that's I pretty much have that pinned down that the most important thing in my life is to move toward a state of awareness that seems to be my deepest truth. And that seems to be a state of awareness that is the least conditioned by subjective emphasis. That's something that feels very true to me. Um, it's also encouraging that that's what's emphasized by all these fucking spiritual gurus, that like that seems to be the path. But that's something that at my core I feel very, very certain about, is that this is a process of peeling away back to truth. So I don't think that it's helpful in the scheme of what you're going for. As far as like, poker is not the end all be all of what I'm going for. What I'm going for is this stabilized state of non-dual non-reactivity where I'm in like a permanent flow state with my environment. If you plant yourself in a grandiose subjective polarity instead of the depressive victim subjective polarity, that's not really pulling the problem out by the roots. So one of the things that we can't really ignore is, and one of the things that I don't think you want to ignore, if you ignore this, then it's almost like a rejection of subjectivity in general. The goal is not to extinguish subjectivity. The goal is to find a way to merge the subjective streaming consciousness with the non-dual consciousness in a way where there's no more identification in the subjectively streaming consciousness. So if we approach something like poker, which is a competitive arena, and we try to act like there's no intention, out of fear that if we label an intention that means that there's ego attached to it, then we're not really getting anywhere. We have to be assertive enough to label that intention and not be afraid that all intention is out of ego itself. If we're engaging in something like poker out of enjoyment and excitement for a competitive sport, then we need some sort of direction in the creative process. It's important to identify a direction in a creative process, otherwise the creative process has no real framework. So the direction in the creative process of something competitive is, in the most non-dual sense, to always be operating at the closest level of mastery that you're capable of through your own state of awareness. Notice that I don't say through your own mind or through your own subjectivity. It's a merge. It's a simultaneous merge between what you're capable of as far as your mental capacity and what you're capable of on a state of awareness. There's no separation between those two. That's sort of what my argument is that state of awareness and mental capacity arise spontaneously as a simultaneous event. It's not like increased state of awareness eventually trickles down into increased mental capacity. It might appear that way in terms of subjectivity needing time to experience results. It's just like the laws of the universe. But as far as like the which came first, the chicken or the egg type thing, this is a simultaneous event of awareness and mind not being separate. Because once you make that separation, that like, here's my awareness and here's the continuum where it trickles down into the mind, now you're introducing locality. Now you're introducing two different points. And if you're truly functioning from the non-dual frame, you're extinguishing locality. So now everything is spontaneous and everything is simultaneous. I'm saying spontaneous in the sense that it's always just happening presently. We're in a realm now that exits time-based subjectivity. So technically everything that's going on is arising spontaneously on a moment-to-moment basis that transcends time. And everything that you're experiencing as far as thoughts in subjective and your connection to the substratum, which is the non-dual state of awareness, that's simultaneously taking place. There's not like a delay from awareness to your mind. In the absolute terms, there's no delay. And from a subjective streaming consciousness, there might be a delay in the sense that that's how we experience time. But if you're truly operating from the non-dual layer, you have to throw out all notions of time. So if we can put this outcome in place, sort of like that we need to have intention, otherwise the creative process doesn't have framework, and that we're gonna allow ourselves to establish intention based on that alone, based on the fact that this isn't out of ego, this isn't out of like, oh, I want to win. That's why I'm not saying our intention is to win. Our intention is not to win. Our intention is to approach the creative arena that we're in at a level that is closest to reflecting mastery as we understand it, which is basically the capacity at which we understand our creative field. Our goal is always to be on target with that level of mastery, as close as we can to it. Otherwise, our creative process doesn't have direction. So, keeping with the whole idea of what can we do to stay with a creative process even when we aren't totally disidentified with it subjectively. Meaning, how do you approach life when you're not enlightened, pretty much, without suffering? How do you soften the suffering process? And at the same time, hopefully, refine the creative process. I think the two definitely go hand in hand. So one of the things I've been thinking about, if we're not going to change the polarity from depressive to grandiose, we see that that's a futile effort. Then it seems like the only thing that we can do is sort of get the mind comfortable with potentially releasing itself into an area where it's softening its own subjectivity, which is a very paradoxical concept for the mind in the sense that you're pretty much asking the mind to speak a language that it doesn't speak. You're asking the mind to go to a level of awareness that transcends its potential. If you listen to all these gurus, what they say is that the mind will never actually be able to understand enlightenment. All the mind will ever really get is the recognition, the felt recognition of what consciousness is. It will never be able to define it in terms of like concept or anything, but it will have this reflection injected into it on account of being engulfed in consciousness, where it becomes comfortable relaxing into the knowing of that transcendent reality without needing concepts to express it. That's pretty much the gist. Something Sparrow talks about a lot. So I think what our goal should be to try to aid this process, because this is what I was thinking about too, is that it seems like the only thing that you can do to catalyze your own realization is to continuously live into a non-dual consciousness. So the higher frequency at which you expose the mind to this awareness, it seems like that catalyzes the process of that awareness engulfing the mind. So the problem that we're having is that we're engaging in stimulus that's dragging us out of a non-dual frame at such a high frequency that it's delaying the process of realization significantly. So my argument is, how do we soften the subjective identification with our outside stimulus on a day-to-day basis with whatever we're doing, especially with shit like poker, which is extremely competitive and which seems to have a very, very strong grip on our subjectivity. So before I sort of like outline what I think the right approach is, I think it's really necessary that we understand why the flow state is beneficial. The flow state softens identification with subjectivity. That has a bunch of really cool effects. One, suffering is decreased. You're now anchored more in the direct experience of life outside of subjective distortion. So one of the things I was thinking about during my session today is that when you're really rooted in awareness, the stimulus has no real impact, is the best way I can describe it. There's no emotional impact on whatever the stimulus is that's going on in your environment. So decrease in suffering is obviously a huge bonus. And it's funny that we're looking for incentive almost to hold a non-dual frame, to hold a flow state. Decrease in suffering is a huge one. This enhanced focus, I kind of think about it as a laser. You start out with this really, really intense, powerful one beam laser. I kind of sort of think that moving into subjectivity, identification with subjectivity, is like putting something in front of that laser that makes it extremely fractal, in the sense that you put something in front of it that shoots it out into 1,000 different directions, and now you have 1,000 lasers, none of which are nearly as powerful as the first initial beam. That's sort of like the focus. I think that's a good metaphor for the focusing mechanism of creative reality. As you enter into subjectively streaming consciousness that's identified with its own creative process, you lose a lot of innate intelligence from the non-dual layer, something that just exists there that without question allows you to have access to a more spontaneous calibration of knowledge. Eckhart talks about how like 99% of the fucking mind's thoughts are repetitive in a subjectively identified state, in a mind identified state. So like that right there is a huge bonus, that you'll have the ability to access a realm where your mind is being fed not only information that is very integral to the present moment, but information that, on account of being integral to the present moment, is feeding you like dynamic ideas, like new, novel ideas. So those two are the two main ones, that your focus is increased and your suffering is decreased. And I think the third one you can sort of say that sort of embodies both of those first two, is that you feel a unity with your entire environment. You feel as if you are connected to your entire environment in a way that you are not holding yourself separate from outcome. And I think this is one of the biggest problems, is that if you look at people with very strong frames, very strong creative frames, I don't know if it could just be that they're conditioned toward grandiosity, in the sense that they believe they're entitled to everything. But one of the things that I think is probably very integral, whether they're aware of it or not, is that people that access a non-dual awareness have it destroys their limiting beliefs. Limiting beliefs are no longer really active when subjective identification is dropped, on account of the fact that you're so intimately connected with your environment that when all that matters is the present moment, there can be nothing that separates you from it. It's this subjective identification that throws up those blocks for you, in the sense of like, here's my outcome, but here's my beliefs that stand in the way of my outcome. This is all Tony Robbins type shit. But it's important to recognize that like in a flow state, all of that is dissolved. So now, it's not even like a process at that point. It's like when everything in baseline reality is dissolved by transcending to a higher level of literally invisible non-dual awareness, then everything goes. Identification with self goes. That means all limiting beliefs go. That means all grandiose beliefs go too. But that's okay, because you're functioning from a layer now that's permeating reality. You don't need belief systems. Time goes. This isn't a process, because you're operating in a present moment, and all your intention is in that present moment is to operate at the closest level of mastery. It's not to beat your opponent, because that would introduce separateness again. This is all this has ever been, is you versus yourself, pretty much. So here's my idea. We have to find a way to soften the subjective emphasis, but we can't train the mind to be the non-dual, because the mind will never be able to train itself in being the non-dual. The mind will only ever be able to be transformed into the non-dual through the grace of the intervention of the non-dual. Only the non-dual will be able to do that. Only awareness will be able to totally engulf the mind. But what we can do in the process is sort of bring the mind closer to the arena where it gives less resistance to that realization, to that transformation. So I think that the way that you do that is to allow the mind to see parts of its engagement with reality that are being very destructive toward the creative process and being destructive toward your goal of overall de-emphasizing separate self. So for instance, every time you lose a pot, if you default into feeling hard done by, getting upset with your opponent because you think you're better than him and he doesn't deserve to be winning this pot in such a ridiculous fashion or whatever, that he got so lucky, whatever it is, here's a big one. Believing that you are further from your outcome on account of being stuck in a session. This is a hugely unconscious one, where when you're stuck, the subjectively identified stream of thought that creeps in is like, fuck, like now I'm further from my outcome than I was when I even sat down to start the session. And that's a really futile emotion to become identified with, because it's almost like you're moving backwards. So you've become identified with your own success. You have this intention of success when you sit down, and then on account of moving backwards, you now feel like you're further from that success and you feel like your entire effort is just futile. So the thing that you have to allow the mind to become aware of in these moments is that that's an extremely subjectively identified process going on. That thought process that you're engaging in is putting a ton of emphasis on your own story, and more importantly that, it's putting a ton of emphasis on time. Anytime you're stuck in time, that should be a clear indicator to the mind that you're in an intensely subjectively identified stream of thought. So as the mind starts to see this kind of stuff, and as this is where I think conceptual framework can aid enlightenment. The mind has to be able to, this is actually really cool, I didn't even think about this when I was starting to record this, but this is what I think is probably the most important point of this. The mind can never actively do anything to attain the non-dual state, but the way the mind can help, the way the mind can be a partner in this, is by becoming aware of its processes that are very dysfunctional to holding that non-dual awareness. So this actually becomes the limitation of the mind is that it can never actively become the non-dual, but it can help it peeling away at itself. And in the process of the mind being a partner in the peeling away process, instead of the intensifying process of its own identification with self, that can catalyze the frequency at which we're able to access a non-dual flow state of awareness. So it's sort of like this. Instead of being in a pot and then, or being stuck 3 buy-ins or whatever after you lose your 3rd buy-in, instead of going into a state where now you feel stuck and you feel like your whole session is futile and you feel like you're moving backwards and you feel like everybody doesn't deserve the money that they've won from you, you cut that train of thought. You cut that train of thought because the mind has actually developed a devotion that it wants to discover this non-dual state, and you've analyzed your own thought processes to the point where the mind has the wisdom now that these types of heavily subjectively identified thought processes are not helping that own self-discovery. So this is, I think, what devotion really is that it's a non-egoic enthusiasm to discover one's deeper truth, where the mind actually becomes a partner in its own dismantlement, which is really intense to think about, that the mind has now hopped on board. The mind is now literally on board with dismantling itself because it believes so deeply that its truth lies at the bottom of all of its conditioning. But it helps to analyze it in these ways where the mind sees stuff like the metaphors, like the laser, like the creative process is clearly distorted and slowed when the mind goes into these types of processes, because the mind is able to recognize that going into time-bound thought causes suffering, in the sense of after you lose pots and shit, that's not helping your flow state. This this emphasis on separateness, where you're competing with other people to try to beat them, none of that is really helping the state where the mind has a recognition that it functions most fluently. Like, the mind knows how it feels when it's involved in a flow state. You have a memory of that, if nothing else. And even though that memory isn't the absolute, because it'll never be in the present moment, a memory can never be present, that memory can spark devotion for the mind to go back and repeatedly try to release itself into that state, because the mind loves that state. The mind loves having the felt recognition that there's something higher that's operating for it, and that it's the benefactor of that relationship too, because all of these, like, really high level thoughts are being filtered down to it. So I think that the answer is to get the mind acquainted with as many different unconscious processes that are taking place, that are throwing it out of a flow state. And as soon as those processes start to creep in, the mind is now an active participant in the fact that it cuts that train of thought off. And that's the extent that the mind can be helpful in this. The mind cannot seek out the flow state. All the mind can do is control itself. And in the controlling of itself, in the quieting of itself, we have a much better chance of entering a non-dual state of awareness that is the product of lack of subjective distortion. So I say we should start with this. It's a very simple process. We have the conviction that our deepest truth lies at the bottom of mental conditioning. That's got to be your deepest conviction. Without it, this isn't going to work. We know that when we feel closest to our truth, it's when there's very little emphasis on subjectivity, which means there's very little subjective distortion going on, which means that we're pretty much at the direct experience of our own reality. We're using that with our creative process to make sure that our creative process stays on track with our overall goal, because the creative process is not our overall goal of existence. Our overall goal of existence is to follow our truth, is to get as close as possible to our truth. So the first rule is that we never allow the creative process to undermine our purpose of our own existence, which is moving from subjectivity back to the non-dual state. Moving from subjectively identified existence back to the non-dual state. There always is going to be subjectivity. To deny it is just stupid, but it doesn't have to be identified with. From there, we teach the mind to recognize how entering the flow state of the non-dual lessens suffering. It decreases suffering. It increases focus, and it transcends duality, in the sense that we no longer pin ourselves against our environment in a way that increases suffering, because that generates fear. So we have this intensely focused, intensely connected reality that has very little suffering in it, and also transcends time, on account of there being no more need to ping for a subjective identity through the present moment. That's the only thing that time is really useful for. It's a mind-bound function that intensifies our own subjective identity by adding moments up and creating a formation out of them. So once the mind sees the benefits of allowing itself to slip into this flow state by releasing its own subjective identification, then we can start to train the mind to recognize the processes that's throwing it out of that flow state. Stuff like being intensely identified with time, in the sense that you're stuck now and you weren't stuck at the beginning of your session, and that means that you're worse off than you were. Um, Belittling players around you by saying they're undeserving, belittling yourself by saying that you're undeserving on account of the fact that you've been running bad for this long, you don't feel like you're playing well. All of that is transcended because it's all seen as unhelpful to the creative outcome, which is to access your own level of mastery, and also to the whole outcome of your existence in general, which is pretty much to get closest to your truth. So it almost requires, though, that you've had experience in the flow state, so that the mind has this recognition of how much it enjoys it there. So if that's the one seek that you engage in, it's the seek of, and this is towing a very fine line. But if there's one seek that's appropriate, it's the devotional seek of the mind, the pure seek, not to attain something for the self, but to literally be invited into a non-dual arena where it is simultaneously obliterated in the sense of identification with its own separate identity, but also the benefactor of being in communion with this state of awareness.